We laid out in the first episode how we're going to be using 4 kinds of different sources, and one of them is a book written by my cousin in around 1878, 1879, Rabbi Elijah Tzvi Soloveitchik.
Yes.
And he goes at length to discuss a topic that isn't entirely obvious.
Mm-hmm.
If you look in the book's called the Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament. Originally, it was called Kol Koreh,
Mm-hmm.
the voice calling out in the wilderness. And it's the first ever Jewish commentary by someone who didn't convert to Christianity,
Mm-hmm.
in this case by an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, on the New Testament. And it starts off, in the days of King Hordos, which is Herod, when Yeshua was born in Beit Lechem of Yehuda, Magi came from the land of the east in Yerushalayim. And then he goes on for a number of pages talking about something which has nothing whatsoever to do with Herod.
It's funny.
And I think we have to talk about that.
Well, do we
goes,
have to
I'm
talk
looking
about
here,
that? Because here's the thing.
Yeah.
Folks, if you didn't get, they probably don't have the book. If you do have the book, it really is quite
You can
fascinating.
get it on Amazon.
But it's called
The Bible, the Talmud, and the New
did you see
Testament.
that as a connection?
I think this is his introduction to the book.
That's what I thought.
In other words, so, and look, in a way, it's important because he's trying to say, okay, what are my sources as this ultra-Orthodox rabbi in the 19th century? What am I using to understand the life of Yeshua?
Mm-hmm.
And he's from the outset telling you that, and he actually, what he's doing is dredging up a debate that goes back to the 13th century. In the 13th century, let me read you a little bit of what he says here in the beginning. This is in the Bible, the Talmud, and the New Testament, and it's on page 73, chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
He says, honored reader, this is an ultra-Orthodox Jew in the 19th century. And there's a statement at the end which is so profound that I think a lot of people missed it. Honored reader, this ancient baseless hatred has been glowing in the hearts of our Christian brothers against our Jewish brothers for over 1,800 years.
Mm-hmm.
They, the Christians, said that our fathers struck down their Messiah for no wrong that he committed, and that we must suffer for the wickedness of our fathers, and they seek his blood from our hands. And it's interesting, I've expressed this to people, a very similar idea, and they said, oh, the Inquisition, that was 500 years ago. Ever hear of the Holocaust? Here he says, until now, their fury has not been appeased, as we saw with the events in Romania. And I was curious, what events is he talking about in Romania? And I looked up in the history books, and I saw there are so many events in Romania of Gentiles attacking Jews, Christians specifically attacking Jews, that I don't even know which event he's talking about.
Mm-hmm.
A modern reader would assume he's talking about the Kishinev massacre, which was the Great Pogrom of 1904, I believe it was. It was on Easter 1904 that the Gentiles, the Christians, went out and started attacking Jews because they were upset that the Jews killed Jesus, right? It was Easter, right? And they had just commemorated the death of Jesus, and now was the time to take vengeance on the Jews. That's the way they saw it. That was actually a pivotal event in Jewish history, the Kishinev massacre of 1904. Bialik wrote the poem Ir HaHariga, the city of slaughter, and it sent Jews flooding out of Eastern Europe. Many went to the land of Israel. My ancestor, my middle name, and I'm named after, Shalom Gordon, he left Eastern Europe after those massacres, or during the time of those massacres, to get away, came to the United States. So what he's talking about isn't something from ancient history. It's something that's still happening today. It happens today in France. Be honest with you, it happens in New York. All right, he goes on. They deem it a mitzvah. I love how he's using these Jewish terms, right? Meaning the Christians, as he understands it, deem it a mitzvah to seek vengeance for his blood, for Jesus' blood, from the hands of their Jewish brothers. And again, most of the people listening to this program, I understand they don't see it this way, but there are Christians in the world today who see it this way. And certainly in history there were. He says, even among our Jewish brothers, who lack understanding and who oppose that Yeshua of Nazareth is the cause of the evil that happens to them, some accuse their Christian brothers and their Messiah, and the fire of the controversy continues to grow. Therefore, I saw it as incumbent upon myself to show everyone that it was not the hand of the Jews that put him to death, and I will show that both our Jewish and Christian brothers are mistaken in their understanding of this. And what's interesting I want to jump to the end of this, and we can talk about this. Yeah. He's asking the question, did the Jews kill Jesus? And really, as an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, he has to wrestle with the question that the Talmud says that there was a man named Yeshua of Nazareth that the rabbis executed on the eve of Passover. Mm-hmm. That's the issue he's struggling with here. here, this is now page 78. This is the end of this 5-page or so excursus on the question of
Right.
who is the Jesus of the Talmud. That's really the question,
Mm-hmm.
right? He starts off saying that they hate us because we killed Jesus and we didn't even do it, and they misunderstood what's in the Talmud. He says, therefore, it is incumbent upon anyone who loves truth and peace, especially those who teach and lead the many, to inform their Christian brothers that they are mistaken in this matter. It is incumbent upon them to eradicate, uproot their baseless hatred that is concealed in their hearts towards their Jewish brothers. So, who is he talking to here? I think he's talking to a Jewish audience who says, look, you got to tell the Christians we didn't kill Jesus. And the Jesus of the Talmud is another man from Nazareth. Look, last week we talked about how Joseph was both the husband of Mary and the father of Mary.
That was 2
Different
weeks ago.
Joseph.
That was 2 weeks ago.
Right. Okay. Well, in the last episode, we talked about how there was a man named Joseph who was the father of Mary and another man named Joseph who was the husband of Mary.
Yeah.
And what he says here is there was more than one man named Yeshua.
Right.
In fact, there was more than one man from Nazareth named Yeshua.
Right.
Now, it's interesting. Recently, we had this whole controversy about 5 or 10 years ago. I remember I was at your house when we watched the documentary on the History Channel. And it was about how they found the tomb of Jesus and there were bones in it. And what was the claim? There was a tomb in Talpiot, and in the tomb there was an ossuary, which is a bone box. And on the bone box, it said Yeshua, the son of Joseph. And they said, Yeshua, the son of Joseph, see? That's Jesus of the New Testament, Jesus of Nazareth. Except there's a second tomb where they, also in the Jerusalem area, where they found the same exact name, obviously from a different person because it's a different tomb. Right. One of the arguments of these people who claim that those were the bones of Jesus was that something like every fourth person was named Yeshua. They actually brought that up themselves, that it was such a common name. So the argument that he brings here, Elijah Tzvi Soloveitchik, is that the Jesus of the New the Jesus of the New Testament is not the same as the Jesus of the Talmud. That there were two different people named Yeshua of Nazareth, and that in later times, he doesn't exactly say this, but he kind of implies it. The rabbis got confused, and what the rabbis tended to do is they would have these figures and they would telescope 5 different people into one person. Right. They do this with King Yanai, who is Alexander Jannaeus of the discussed by Josephus, and we have coins that he minted today. So Alexander Yanai was the king of Israel, actually, from 103 to 76 BC. But every king of the Hasmoneans that the rabbis don't like, they call King Yanai, right? They call John Hyrcanus Yanai. So that what they do is they take a bunch of different figures who have something in common from their perspective, and they kind of crunch them into one figure. And the reason is that, the rabbis had these legends and these stories and these traditions. They didn't necessarily know all that much about history, about which century things took place. So what Rabbi Soloveitchik shows here is that there's one Yeshua who's mentioned in the Talmud who lived in the time of Rabbi Yoshua ben Parachia, sometime around 70 or 80 BC. Well, that's not Yeshua of Nazareth. There's another one who lived during the time of Bar Kokhba, sometime around 132 to 135 AD. Well, how could that be Yeshua of Nazareth? So the point is that so he makes the argument that there's a figure in the Talmud called Yeshua, and that's not Yeshua of Nazareth. I would say it's a little bit different, that there's several different figures in the Talmud who the rabbis didn't care for, let's put it that way, they had disagreements with, and they kind of clumped them all together into one figure. One of those figures is the son of Pappos, who lived in the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? And we don't know much about him. There's a lot of confusion about who that is exactly. Long story short, he's saying that you can't take statements in the Talmud about Yeshua and take those as historical descriptions of Yeshua of Nazareth.
Now, let me
that's
say
that's the bottom line there.
I will say something that I found it a little strange that we started off with Matthew 2:1, and then he goes into these 5 pages. But then as I thought about it and reflected on it, actually the timing of it is actually really perfect, because I'll tell you something, Nehemia, I don't know if you know this or not, but there are some people who would love to be able to make it simple and say, well, it was this. In other words, let me back up a second. What I appreciated about what he was doing is he was further explaining the confusion around the statement. The statement is the Jews killed Jesus or
Right.
Yeshua, and he just went in to bring more information to say, now you're probably confused. You may have heard this statement in the Talmud. That's not the same person. You may have heard this statement in the Talmud. That's not the same person. So I actually appreciated what he was doing. It's
Right.
just that it was
And there's definitely some truth in what he's saying. In
Yeah.
other words, so this is a debate that goes back to the 13th century. The 13th century, there was this Jewish convert to Christianity who wrote a letter to the Pope, and he said to the Pope, "You've got to burn the Talmud because it's full of blasphemies against our Lord Jesus Christ."
right.
And so they began what was known as the trial of Paris. And the Talmud was actually put on trial, and the Jewish side was defended by a rabbi named Yechiel of Paris. And Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, he came up with this idea that Yeshu HaNotzri, Jesus of Nazareth in the Talmud, is not the same as Jesus Christ of the Christians. They lived in different periods, and they have different biographies. Even though in one place he's called Yeshu HaNotzri, Yeshua of Nazareth, at least in one place. There was another rabbi in the same period who we've talked about in our different discussions, Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, Ramban in Hebrew, not to be confused with Rambam. Ramban, he had a dispute with Pablo Cristiani in 1263, and he argued that no, it is the figure. It's the same figure, right? That the rabbis just have different traditions about him than what we know from the New Testament. And look, it's very possible, very likely, let's put it this way. Most historians, if you ask them, can you take what the Talmud says about Jesus as historical information from the time of Jesus? What they would respond is, the rabbis had no idea about what happened in the life of Jesus. These are rabbis 100 or 200 or 300 years later who had a conversation with a Christian, and all they know about what Jesus taught or did is what they heard from that Christian. And there's something to be said for that. And that also explains why they take 3 or 4 different figures from history, a disciple of Rabbi Yeshua ben Parachia, this figure during the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, and probably the historical Jesus, and they telescope them into a single figure because they don't really know. It's hundreds of years later. It's like, you'll talk to people, I don't know, about the American Revolution, and they'll think that George Washington did everything, or the American Civil War, and they'll think that Ulysses S. Grant went to Texas to free the slaves, right? Well, as far as I know, Grant never went to Texas. It was your ancestor, right? So today we can look it up on Wikipedia, and hopefully that's true half the time, at least half the time. There's ways of finding things out. Back then, they just had their memories, right? These things weren't even written down. It was my rabbi told me this story, and his rabbi told him this story, and a lot of it gets confused in the telling. So there's some truth that when the rabbis are talking about certain figures, look, there's a figure the rabbis talk about, they call him Posheh Israel, the sinner of Israel. And some rabbis came along and said that's a euphemism for Jesus. I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Right? There's another rabbi who's called the other one. Who's the other one? Well, we don't know. We think that's not Jesus. The other one is another rabbi who became an apostate, who became essentially an Epicurean who denied that God had interaction with the world. So there's all these coded terms in the Talmud, right? There's this Ben Sdata, and they're trying to figure out who is this son of Sdata. Well, he's some arch villain who has a huge following, who people thought was a Messiah. Well, who else is from the perspective of the rabbis, someone we disagree with, who people think is a Messiah, who has a huge following? So they combine these two figures who have nothing to do with each other. And maybe he puts this here in chapter 2, because, up until now, you could say we're dealing with kind of, not the actual life of Jesus, but in a sense, you're dealing with the virgin birth, which is, if you believe it, it's a miracle, right? So in a sense, it's not really part of history, right? That's what secular historians would say. It's not part of, a secular historian can't deal with it as history because it's a supernatural event. You believe it, great. You don't, then you don't. Here we're dealing maybe for the first time with, we know Herod, he existed, right? We know these are events in history, right? That Herod killed anybody who opposed him, and we'll get to that in a minute. But famously, Augustus, Augustus Caesar, he famously said it's better to be Herod's son, pig than his son. It's better to be Herod's pig than his son. And why is that? Because Herod, being sort of a Jew, doesn't eat pig, and therefore doesn't kill pigs, but he does kill his sons. Herod literally killed his own son. I believe he drowned him in a bathtub or something like that. So the point is that now we're getting to history. So the rabbi's stepping up and he's saying, okay, what do we know from history about Jesus? Well, no, we're not looking at the Talmud. We're not looking at Toldot Yeshu. Those are legends. Some of them aren't even about Jesus of Nazareth. So let's look at the New Testament, take it at face value, and try to understand what it says.